Okay, in this video, I want to spend some time talking about the second half of the chapter on the myth of the Promised Land, focusing in particular on an example of a subnational reinterpretation of the myth. All right, so just some review. Remember, we're talking about the myth of the Promised Land, which is this idea that the Pilgrims and Puritans were predestined to settle America as a result of their being exceptional people. And this plays into the idea of the broader concept of American exceptionalism. So, crucial to the project is a view that God is willing them to form this new society. So, a crucial aspect of Protestantism that's important for understanding the motivations is this idea of an emphasis on literal biblical truth and appropriation of biblical themes. So central to the formation of the myth of the Promised Land is the use and reinterpretation of specific central biblical themes which emphasize Exodus, divine providence, and a journey to the Promised Land. So as Paul writes, the religious narrative was turned into a cultural myth by reconfiguring the ingredients of the biblical story. Human suffering under slavery, God's sympathy for the oppressed, divine providence, a sacred journey to a promised land, and claims of God-given entitlement into a potent narrative of American beginnings, which constitutes a core foundational myth of the United States. So, for example, this notion of suffering can be reinterpreted as the lack of religious freedom in England. The sacred journey to the promised land is reinterpreted as the traveling across the Atlantic. So reusing these themes in order to motivate and explain the journey and the settling of a new utopian society. And as we also saw, the myth then plays a role in maybe disguising challenges or reinterpreting the challenges they face once they land here in North America, in order to continue to motivate them to press on despite what might be doubts about the potential for success in what many would call the savage wilderness of North America, the untamed land of North America. And so we get this juxtaposition between the sort of the grand vision of the promised land on the one hand, and then the challenges that are faced on the other. And we saw these in Bradford's Of Plymouth Plantation. So there was a lot of talk of a utopian society. Many of those who traveled here to North America were motivated by utopian visions, but the reality was different. And the reality was different because, first and foremost, the land was untamed, and the challenge of cultivating the land, producing a physical society here in North America, was a daunting one. And then, additionally, there was the challenge of relations with the indigenous population. So Bradford has two important passages, one where he describes the difficulty of the journey, which risked those who are coming here to North America to feel as though maybe the journey wasn't worth it. And so this is where the ideological role of myth starts to play a role. Well, the journey has to be hard, for after all, the Exodus in the Bible was also difficult. And so here, the notion of the biblical themes can be used to camouflage the challenge and continue to motivate, much in the same way that religious faith pushes us through specific challenges we face. And then later, Bradford describes the settlers facing a savage wilderness that can be contrasted with God's heavenly kingdom. So this was this idea that there can be a radical discrepancy between dogma and experience, between ideological construction and empirical reality. So myth plays an important role in upholding and reinforcing what we might call dogma, or what we might call ideology. And these things can be contrasted with empirical reality. So in light of a discrepancy, we have to reinforce, reassert the ideological construction. So for example, in the journey here to North America, when there were great challenges faced, when there was illness and death, the biblical notion of the Exodus helped to reinforce that the difficulty was part of the importance of the journey. And so we get, in this way, a kind of martyrdom. All right. Nevertheless, despite the challenges faced by the early settlers, the myth persists. And here I want to spend a little bit more time talking about how the myth is appropriated and reused as time marches on, and then juxtapose it with the African American experience, and in particular, how they relate to this myth as it's carried forward into more current history. So despite the challenges that call into question the validity of the myth, it continues to be employed to cement a national identity. So here, the myth of the Promised Land helps to shape this notion of a coherent, maybe singular vision of what it is to be American and the nature of the nation itself. So, for example, Thomas Jefferson draws a close relationship between the will of God and early American settlers. He writes, "That being in whose hands we are, who led our fathers, as Israel of old, from their native land, and planted them in a country flowing with all the necessaries and comforts of life." All right, so that being, the capital B, signifies that he's here talking about God. The fathers are the original Pilgrims and Puritans, those who came here first, just as in the Exodus, there was a fleeing from the native land, right? And we get utopian language here, a country flowing with all the necessaries and comforts of life. This idea that there's a bounty here in North America to be harvested and harnessed to produce the utopian society. So here, therefore, we get this idea of predestination reasserted. It's God's will that the settlers came here and formed the early colonies. Likewise, we see the persistence of the myth in the treatment of Plymouth Rock as a relic of commemoration. So Tocqueville writes, for example, "Here is a stone which the feet of a few poor fugitives pressed for an instant, and this stone becomes famous. It is treasured by a great nation. A fragment is prized as a relic." And I emphasize this here because one of the aspects of American mythology is physical objects and then also symbols. So think, for example, of all of the symbolism on a dollar bill or a $20 bill. These are themselves symbols which reassert the greatness of America. And the Plymouth Rock as a stone plays a role in cementing this notion of commemoration. People still go visit it as a way of commemorating that historical past. Just another example, Daniel Webster, who was a U.S. Secretary of State, visits Plymouth and in a speech reasserts many of the prominent dimensions of the myth. So, for example, that North America is a religious refuge, so a place for people to flee in order to gain for themselves religious freedom from persecution. The exile of Pilgrim Fathers, this notion of exile, of fleeing for a better land, is a reassertion of the biblical theme. The treatment of early settlers as martyrs. So, in light of the great challenges of settling a new society in an untamed North America, we can reconceive of the settlers as martyrs, as sacrificing themselves for the greater good, for the formation of the society itself. The treatment of Plymouth as distinct and exceptional, And the description of the landing at Plymouth Rock as what Paul says a singular temporal constellation, or kairos. In other words, a formative, important moment, a world historical moment where the trajectory of humanity is changed. And I think here we should look at this from both angles. We could look at it from a critical angle, but also an affirmative angle. A critical angle would be to say that this really overemphasizes the importance of a particular moment and of America more generally. On the other hand, you might conceive of America, especially in light of American capitalism and American global military dominance, as a kind of singular, exceptional place. So, two ways of looking at this notion of formative moments. The achievements and efforts of the Pilgrims and Puritans are also commemorated in the U.S. Capitol with images in the rotunda and statues of Williams and Winthrop. So there's more commemoration of and imagery and physical objects like statues. And then the notion of the Pilgrims and Puritans as predestined, so the myth of the Promised Land, also plays an important ideological role in regional struggles during America's early years. And by ideological, I mean a vision of politics as the regions of America struggle for dominance to be the most prominent part of the nation. So it was employed, for example, to differentiate New England from the American South. And the differentiation here would be echoing back to the earlier differentiation between the Pilgrims and the Puritans on the one hand and the settlers of Jamestown. Remember that the settlers of Jamestown are conceived of as being motivated by material gain, whereas the Pilgrims and Puritans are motivated by a desire for spiritual gratification and satisfaction. And then also here, this is anticipating other more prominent distinctions between the North and the South, especially as it relates to views of slavery. Next, to spread Puritanism and Protestantism in the West and to contain slavery in the South. So at a time, the West is viewed as an area of great opportunity and potential, and the North and the South become sort of like locked into a Cold War conflict, so to speak, in trying to gain that territory. And certainly the North uses the values of Puritanism and Protestantism to try to put a foothold into the West. And then additionally, the myth is used to maintain power over Catholic newcomers. So the Protestants want to assert a kind of hierarchy where they are at the top of that hierarchy. And so as a result of their being the first here and playing such an important role in the formation of the society, it would follow that they have a kind of hierarchical power over the Catholic newcomers. All right, now I want to turn to an important challenge to the myth. And this is going to be related to the concept of subnational identities. So here I want to talk about the African American experience, especially as it relates to the early days of America, the view that America is exceptional, and the view that America is a kind of promised land. So it should be no surprise that standing in sharp contrast to the image of America as exceptional, this notion conveyed by the myth of the Promised Land is the perspective that the perspective of Africans who were brought to North America and forced to work on the cotton fields and in the plantation households. And so the Promised Land for them entailed cruel enslavement, bondage, forced labor, cultural destruction, and death. So quite the contrast from the rosy idealistic vision of the Promised Land as a place of freedom, often contained within the myth of the Promised Land itself. So in early America, it's important to note that the Puritan culture was often exclusionary. It excluded servants, women, Africans, and the indigenous population. So here we get a reassertion of this idea of myth playing an ideological role, as myth reasserting ideology over empirical reality. So when Paul says slavery in America presented a fact that was camouflaged by an ideologically fraught racial discourse that portrayed America as a land of freedom and deliverance, what she means is that there's a fact. The fact is that early Africans were enslaved by the Americans, and the ideology of the Promised Land as being a place of freedom and deliverance obscures the empirical fact of slavery itself. So here we get this idea that myth can play this ideological function. It can distort our thinking by emphasizing important details and overlooking facts which count against those details. And slavery counts against, straight away, the idea of America as a land of freedom and deliverance, because that was just the opposite of the experience of early African Americans. But despite that, and this is where it becomes a little bit more complicated and where we are not going to be just purely critical of the myth, we need to grapple with the fact that the Protestant groups, they play an important role in the abolition movement, and that the North and South eventually went to war over the topic. Right? So if we focus on the fact that the myth of the Promised Land often emphasizes New England as an exceptional place, as a world historic place, as a kind of utopia, and if we then note that the North was the first to abolish slavery and to fight a war over slavery, well, then we need to grapple with the fact that maybe some of this idea of exceptionalism is valid. It's true. Maybe it's true even despite injustices of the past. So here we need to reflect on the prominence of New England in the myth of the Promised Land, especially in light of its earlier opposition to slavery. So this earlier opposition, I just want to emphasize, because it's not total opposition. They did have to abolish it here, obviously, because there was slavery here. So just some important reflection questions. What should we make of this contradiction? This idea that Protestants played a role in slavery, but then played a role in the abolition of slavery. And also, how should we conceive of that for ourselves? So does the use of slavery in the North count against the idea of the Pilgrims and Puritans as exceptional? Or does the early turn against slavery count in favor of the idea of there being exceptional people? More generally, what should we make of individuals when we evaluate them morally when they have a flawed past? Can people redeem themselves by righting the ship, by doing the right thing? What's the relationship between the views of early American Protestants on slavery and the national identity as a whole? So supposing early American Protestants were those who moved towards abolition earlier than others, does that count against there being a national identity? So given this early American cultural divide on the question of slavery, does it make sense to talk of a singular national identity as something that we might call Americanness? Does that really exist? If there was such a deep divide about such an important issue, was there a national identity at all? Were there two national identities? And then I think we can extrapolate from this and think about whether or not today there is a singular American national identity. If there's some essential features that hold in all of America despite our differences, or whether our differences are becoming so stark that we're losing the sense of national identity. So related to this is an important intellectual debate regarding Protestantism in early American culture, and especially the role it plays in the lives of American slaves themselves. So African American slaves were often indoctrinated in Protestantism. Maybe some voluntarily accepted Protestantism and were moved by it. But we need to think about what role religion itself could play in the perpetuation of the myth, particularly as it relates to the African American experience of the Promised Land. So, two sides to this debate. On one side, we see arguments that religious indoctrination taught the slaves submissiveness, docility, and a negative self-concept based on claims of their unworthiness in the eyes of God. Okay, so on this side of the debate, religion was used as a tool by slave owners, to render slaves more submissive, to make them believe as if they deserved this treatment. And if they deserved this treatment, then they would be more easy to control. On the other side of the debate, we see arguments that actually Christianity offered African American slaves access to symbolic resources which they could use for their own purposes. And the relative freedom in which they could gather to practice their own faith allowed them to secretly engage in other social, cultural, and political practices. So on this side of the debate, the adoption of religion, Christianity, and Protestantism is conceived of as maybe playing a positive role in the lives of African American slaves, because it gives them conceptual resources for understanding their experience. And perhaps it also gives them conceptual resources for changing their experience. So this is what I think Paul means when she says the symbolic resources which they could use for their own purposes. In other words, the myth of the Promised Land and especially the religious aspects of the myth of the Promised Land could be reinterpreted, reappropriated in order to conceive of an African American project. Just as earlier, the Pilgrims and Protestants reappropriated, reinterpreted biblical scripture in order to enhance their pursuits and to explain and justify their move from England to North America. So we need to think about, well, how could African Americans in this time period use the myth of the Promised Land to their advantage? So regarding this debate about whether religion and Protestantism in particular were a positive or a negative force in the lives of African Americans, we have just two examples I want to point out. So on the one hand, we have the narrative of Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, which portrays a pious and obedient Uncle Tom whose religious indoctrination prevents him from fully categorizing or understanding the wrongs done to him. So here, the criticism would be that religious indoctrination produces a kind of obfuscation, right? It prevented Uncle Tom from understanding that he was being wronged because it clouded his judgment, it clouded his reality, it clouded his thinking. He came to see himself as deserving of this treatment, as playing a specific role in history. Right? And so this would be the idea that religious indoctrination enhances submissiveness and docility among slaves, and then they're easier to control. And Uncle Tom in Uncle Tom's Cabin is an example of this. So for critics, Stowe's narrative exemplifies the relationship between myth, ideology, and power. So the myth plays a role in enforcing the ideology, and by doing so, it produces an unequal power dynamic, or it reinforces an unequal power dynamic. In this instance, it reinforces the unequal power dynamic between slaveholder and slave, because it causes the slave to conceive of him or herself as destined to be in this position, and that renders them more docile. On the other hand, we have the biblical story of the Exodus in the Promised Land. This is also an important aspect of the myth of the Promised Land, which provided African American slaves with a religious narrative model of emancipation, escape, and freedom. And remember, the myth of the Promised Land is partly about fleeing religious prosecution, going on a journey, so going for an escape, and then gaining freedom in a utopia. So the question is, how could the myth of the Promised Land be reappropriated with these themes in mind in order to produce a new version of the myth for African Americans themselves? So in this latter view, the general structure of the myth of the Promised Land, setting aside the particular details of Pilgrims and Puritans, it can be viewed as a device of collective empowerment, in this instance, the collective empowerment of African Americans. All right, so this leads us finally to this idea of subnational interpretation. Remember, so when we're looking at a myth from the subnational perspective, we're looking at how the myth is experienced, first and foremost, by minority groups or particular groups within a society or culture, but then how also those groups reappropriate the myth and use it for their own purposes. And by so doing, round out our understanding of the American experience. So the myth of the Promised Land was in fact appropriated and readapted by African Americans in a few different ways. So here's just 5 interrelated ways that the myth is reappropriated or reinterpreted and employed, in particular for the project of African American freedom. So most generally, popular African American spirituals use biblical themes and stories from the Exodus narrative to envision freedom. So using these themes of Exodus, of a journey, of a utopia, to envision freedom in the future, to have faith in the future, right? So remember, myth plays this crucial role of giving us a hope for the future, just as religious faith can help us push through difficulties. So by reinterpreting and reappropriating the myth, African Americans could devise a story which would provide them a vision for the future that would motivate them. More practically, for many African Americans, Canada was seen as the new promised land. So, okay, we are here. This isn't the promised land. We need to go on a new exodus, and there's this other place where we can get freedom. Relatedly, for Southern African Americans, Northern American cities were characterized as a kind of promised land. And so there's the Great Migration north to northern cities. A little bit more radically, the idea of Exodus and the myth of the Promised Land is appropriated to conceive of a return to Africa. So this would be sort of like the ultimate full circle Exodus back to the real utopia, which would be home. And then later, the myth of the Promised Land is reapplied to American society to imagine its improvement, right? So we get this in the activism of Martin Luther King Jr. So rather than having an exodus, rather than finding some new place, the utopia is America itself, and it can be realized if only we can have the proper reforms that end policies of, for example, segregation and discrimination, and thereby render America itself the utopia that the original myth of the Promised Land had envisioned and hoped for.